This is not a new interview. This is from the New York launch of Switch 2 a few months ago, and shout out to Dut Squire in the comments for drawing my attention to it. So why am I digging it up now? Well, I do think it's pretty interesting, both for hard details, such as specifics about the top-facing USB functionality, and for lovely, behind-the-scenes information, like how the three people in charge of Switch 2 actually managed the difficult job of designing the system. Basically, I think it's one of the most revelatory interviews that I've come across from the press tour, not for massive things, but for tiny details, and I feel like it perhaps deserves a wider audience. The press conference was transcribed by VentureBeat, and in the manner of other content I've done like this, I'm going to read and then chip in now and then with a few observations or comments. Firstly, the three figures introduce themselves as follows. Koichi Kawamoto says, I entered Nintendo in 1997. For the past maybe 10 years, I've been focusing on software development. I was the producer, for example, on Ring Fit Adventure. I was also working with Mr. Koizumi, the overall director for the Nintendo Switch. This time, on the Nintendo Switch 2, I was a producer. Tetsuya Sasaki says, I entered Nintendo in 1995. It's 30 years for me at Nintendo this year. As a developer, I first started working on systems work on the Nintendo GameCube. Specifically on the Nintendo Switch, I helped with the hardware system, hardware development, network systems. I worked over all those in a support role. On the Nintendo Switch 2, I'm the technical director. Takahiro Dota says, I entered Nintendo in 2003 as a programmer. Recently, I became involved as the technical director of the Legend of Zelda series on Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. On the Nintendo Switch 2, I served as the director. The question says, how was the experience of filming the Nintendo Direct? Can you share what that was like? Sasaki says, I probably struggled the most of everyone here. First of all, I was born and raised in Kyoto. I'm from the Kansai area of Japan. When I was told I was going to be in the direct, I spent a lot of time practicing the script. The person who coached me through all of that said, just be yourself. So I really put my all into it. Come the day of filming, I went with confidence. I spoke my lines, and I was told, your Kyoto dialect is very strong. I need you to fix that. I didn't know what to fix where. I had to have someone guide me line by line. With their help, I was somehow able to get through the filming. End quote. I thought this was an interesting comment that I hadn't seen mentioned before, so I thought I'd look it up in the Kansai dialect and its perceptions. Wikipedia quotes a 2003 book, Studies in Regionalism and Communication and the Effect of the Kansai Dialect on It, and observes that Kansai speakers are often viewed as more funny or talkative than typical speakers of other Japanese dialects, and that Tokyo people can sometimes imitate the Kansai dialect to provoke laughter or inject humour. This seems linked to the strong comedy industry in Kyoto's neighbouring city of Osaka, although EnjoyKyoto.net has this to say on the specific differences in Kyoto. They say, one of the primary distinctions lies in pronunciation. Kyokobota features softer consonants and more elongated vowels, which contribute to its gentle, more flowing sound. Specific pitch accents can also help to give the dialect its unique musicality. This melodiousness contrasts sharply with the more robust sounds of other regional dialects in Japan, even its neighbouring dialect, Osaka-ben, which it shares many characteristics and vocabulary with. Nowadays, younger speakers of Kyoto dialects may speak a less pronounced version, and to casual listeners, it may even be difficult to discern whether the speaker hails from Kyoto or Osaka. But you're likely to encounter stronger accents with older Kyotoites, and perhaps also with those who work in the traditional arts and/or hospitality. Another characteristic of Kyoto dialect is its extensive use of unique honorifics and polite expressions. Words and phrases are often modified to show politeness, fitting for a city that birthed many of Japan's traditional arts and the etiquette and behavioral rules that came along with them. Words are often spoken to sound more inviting and less direct. In fact, among Japanese, Kyoto dialect is typically thought of as both refined and feminine, and appealing enough to frequently rank highly in popularity surveys on regional dialects, as in this one from the travel company Jalan in 2021, in which Kyoto's dialect came out at number 2, cutest dialogue in the country. End quote. At any rate, I feel somewhat sorry for Sasaki-san for having his accent chided, and it just shows the level of detail that Nintendo put into their presentation for Japan. The next question reveals another amusing feature of the original Direct. They were asked, "You might have noticed that Kawamoto-san and I have jackets, but Mr. Dota doesn't. Anything you want to say about that?" Dota says, "When everyone got their outfits, Mr. Kawamoto and Mr. Sasaki got these nice jackets. I was waiting for mine. Then I was told, this colour looks good on you, so I didn't get a jacket. It's not that I forgot my jacket. To all of you who watch the Direct, do you know why I'm wearing a shirt in this colour? See, Mr. Sasaki is the actual body of the Joy-Con 2, then Mr. Kawamoto is the left side, and I'm the right side." End quote. There are a few quizzes on the tech details and a brief explanation that VRR allows for choppy footage to be rendered more smoothly. Sasaki also confirms that, like the Nintendo Switch 2 will be compatible with old GameCube controllers, which is pretty cool. However, a really interesting question focuses on the USB ports. The question says, "I had a question about the two USB-C ports. I've used display glass made by Xreal and others with PC handhelds. Is that something that could be possible with the USB-C ports on the Nintendo Switch 2? Or do you have other types of accessories in mind?" Kawamoto responds, "In terms of supporting glasses, it's not an official Nintendo product, so it's hard to say. But in terms of video output, it's only from the bottom USB-C port. The top USB-C port doesn't support that." End quote. So this is of interest to me, as I had long speculated about the ability to potentially plug in different accessories at the top, and this does rule out some of those possibilities. No chance of an additional DS screen just for one, or at least not one that connects via video out. The input does suggest that the primary reason at this point is for the camera, and I expect that to continue indefinitely as the major usage of the top USB port. But of course, Nintendo likes to sweat its assets and experiment, so I don't necessarily expect that this will be the only use they will put it to before the console is done. The next question is interesting to me because it's basically ducked. Years of media training coming to the fore here. Question: an issue that many players faced with the original Switch Joy-Con was stick drift. Is this something that's been improved with the Joy-Con 2 and the Pro Controller 2 as well? Sasuke says, "As you may have witnessed and felt, the new Joy-Con 2 controllers have been designed from the ground up from scratch. They've been designed to have bigger movements and also smoother movement." End quote. So now, actual talk about stick drift. Legally, I doubt they can acknowledge that A, it existed in the past, and B, they're committed to stopping it in the future, as it might open them up to subsequent legal complaints. Also, since these guys aren't in Nintendo's legal team, I have some sympathy with them not wanting to put themselves on the line by answering a question that their legal team would roast them for even entertaining. Ultimately, if stick drift is ever to be addressed, which I don't expect it will be, it should probably come from the top, likely even from Furukawa himself. This next question is exciting though. Question: are there any features, any capabilities that you wanted to implement into the Switch 2 but had to drop in the end? Kawamoto responded, "Those I want to keep for the future, so I can't tell you. I will say that some of the features that were newly added to the Nintendo Switch 2 were features we wanted to have in the Nintendo Switch, but now that it's become the Nintendo Switch 2, we're able to add them. That's even more of a reason why I can't share any details." End quote. I don't imagine it's a great surprise that Nintendo stockpiles ideas and waits for their right time to deploy, but it does make me wonder what features they have in mind for the future that would have fitted Switch 2 but didn't actually come to pass at this point in time. As Sasuke notes, there's a lot of technology and a lot of features crammed in there, which I guess is his way of saying that we have to be content with what we have for a while yet. Further discussion in the interview discusses the non-compatible software such as Labo, but then we get this one on the origin of the mouse mode idea, which includes some details that I haven't heard before. Question. When we use a mouse with our computers, we usually have a desk or table in front of us. But when we're playing video games, we're usually on a sofa. What was the inspiration to put a mouse in this experience? Karamoto says that's a very good question. When I was playing PC games, I thought that the experience of playing with a mouse is fun. It's engaging. I was thinking, what if we could bring this to the Nintendo Switch 2? So we brought it to the Nintendo Switch 2. But as you mentioned, usually a table is quite far away when you're sitting on the sofa. It really depends on the material, but we've made adjustments so you can control the mouse on your pants. I don't know if you've had the chance to play yet, but Drag and Drive, you can play that while using the mouse controls on your pants. There are some people on the development side who prefer to play the game that way. Dota adds, because of the environment we're in, it's a hands-on experience. The mouse controls had to be tethered, but if you purchase it, I hope you'll give it a try on your own and see what they feel like without the tethers. End quote. I've mentioned this previously, but when I had an optical mouse at university in the early 2000s, I'd often run out of desk space and run the mouse from my lap on a stack of books or even up the side of the desk once. It worked just fine, and that was over 20 years ago, so I never perceived this as a major obstacle. As it happens, I don't find the mouse mode in the Nintendo Switch 2 quite as responsive as I might have hoped all of the time, but I did manage to get my hands on a Kirby mouse mat, which was on the Nintendo UK My Nintendo store, and that's going very nicely. The safety issue around game chat naturally crops up as well, and they reiterate the key safeguard procedures that they already have in place. Question. With the new chat features, how did you design this with safety in mind? What's to stop players from using it in an inappropriate way, especially as a lot of people who use the Switch are younger players? Sasuke says, first of all, in terms of safety, this is compatible with the Parental Controls app. Parental controls for the minor who's going to be using the hardware can be set and controlled through the app. Karamoto adds, the only people that minors will be able to chat with are those friends that their parents have approved. Dota says when it's just two adults, they also need to be friends with each other to be able to chat. You won't find yourself in a situation where you'll be placed in a chat with strangers. You can import your friends from the Nintendo Switch to do some fine-tuning, because there are bound to be people who like to chat and people who prefer not to chat. Kawamoto explains, ultimately, if something does happen, if you're chatting with someone you don't want to chat with, there is also a report feature. End quote. The next question is fun, as it shows the length of time Nintendo took, years it would seem, before settling on the Switch 2 name. Let's hear from the developers and then discuss. Question. What was your thought process with choosing the name for the Nintendo Switch 2? Karamoto says, there's not really a rule that Nintendo follows, but it's true that we haven't named a hardware like this before. The naming process for this hardware between the three of us throughout the year, we've had this multiple times. Dota says, the process went where we'd gather, have a meeting, try to brainstorm some ideas, not come up with anything, and then say, we'll try next time. Have a meeting, brainstorm names, not come up with everything. This rinse and repeat continued for probably several years. Kawamoto says the idea of something that you might think might be Nintendo-like, say Super Nintendo Switch, I guess that did come up, but we weren't sure that it was quite the right name. The cycle continued. Calling it the Super Nintendo Switch would harken back to the Super NES, but the NES and Super NES didn't have compatibility. Since Nintendo Switch 2 had lots of compatibility with Nintendo Switch titles, we thought maybe Super Nintendo Switch wasn't the right direction to go in. At the same time, we wanted to make sure that the name really reflected the idea that this is the latest Nintendo Switch, a new standard for what Nintendo Switch is, hence we came up with Nintendo Switch 2. End quotes. Now, firstly, I think it's interesting that they're self-aware enough to know that Super is, I guess, the expected mode of Nintendo showing an improvement or development, not just from Super NES, but also Super Nintendo World, despite the fact that it's not really been a great habit of their consoles to use this adjective with the Game Boy Advance, 3DS, and Wii U all opting for quite different ways of marking themselves out from their predecessors. Still, I don't see compatibility going away anytime soon, and I doubt future consoles will be in the super category either. Of course, that's not necessarily to say that the next step is Switch 3. This name does seem to have come from a degree of desperation, reflecting that they really were perfecting the original Switch rather than innovating massively from it. There's no mention of who was in these meetings, but I find it interesting that multiple meetings over years were dedicated to naming, despite the fact that the Switch 2 or Super Switch both were kind of universally expected. I guess this shows both due diligence to ensuring that they have considered every option and a certain degree of analysis paralysis that in all that time and with people working heavily on the system, still not having thought of a better name, they didn't just commit to the one name. Perhaps it also shows that they, like us, are cautious about a Nintendo that is perceived to be iterative rather than fully innovative, cautious as opposed to daring. It's not a look that fits the company as comfortably, and so I can see why they might have experienced internal pushback from a name which does suggest iteration. The next question reiterates the 2019 start date from Karamoto's perspective, but emphasizes the use of magnets as an example of a holdover from the original Switch development. They also comment on battery life, GameCube emulation, and DLSS usage as follows. Dota says, with the Nintendo Switch 2, because of things like game chat, the workings of the system side are a lot more complex. That's why, because of that, the variability of battery life is even broader than it was for Nintendo Switch. Comparing battery life between Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2, it is difficult to do because of those variables between the two systems. Kawamoto adds, the CPU for the Nintendo Switch 2 does take a lot more power, but to adjust for that, we've also increased the battery size. Again, though, it depends on the conditions and the environment you're playing in, so it's difficult to give a precise answer. End quote. After this, there are questions on emulation for GameCube, DLSS, and frame rates, which more or less go over what is now old ground. However, the next quote is of particular interest to me in terms of the impact of other world factors on the development of the Nintendo Switch 2. One of my long-term research projects is actually into the effect of COVID on Nintendo, although because of long development times, it may be years before we fully know what the impacts truly were. However, Sasaki is very clear in his answer to this question. Question. When you developed the system, did issues around chip shortage and costs, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, factor into your process? Sasaki responds, yes. For example, COVID certainly had a large impact on the development and design process. With the chip shortage, as we worked with our partners, we had to be creative in how we worked our way around that. Even the Nintendo Switch was hard to get at one point. End quote. What's interesting is that he starts by talking about the development and design, but then pivots to the chip shortage. I think there is a very strong chance that we may never get confirmation that the chip shortage prevented a mid-gen refresh, which might have made the likes of Mario Kart World, which we now know was originally designed for Switch, more of a possibility on the original hardware. As for the design process, this seems like a nod of the head to Game Chat, at least, which clearly owes a lot to the COVID era video conferencing experiences. What's not clear, of course, is how much of this was in train anyway, given the need for the Switch to add its own social functionality, but that question is probably too hypothetical for even the people on the ground to adequately answer. On LCDs over OLED, Sasaki says, there are a lot of advancements that have been made in LCD technology. During development, we took a look at the LCDs that were available to us, and after a lot of consideration, we decided to stick with LCD. And Kawamoto adds, even with the OLED version of the Nintendo Switch, we didn't have support for HDR, and that's something we can support now. Dota also confirms the GPU does support ray tracing, as was the case with the DLSS. This provides another tool for them. End quote. Further comments discuss the camera, and this I find quite interesting too. Question. We saw that Nintendo Switch 2 will support third-party cameras for game chat. Is there any way to tell if an existing 4K USB-C camera will work with Switch 2? Is there any limiting factor that can affect whether cameras will support facial recognition features? Sasky says, from a hardware perspective, we wanted to try to support as much as possible. However, from the perspective of fine-tuning and making sure that everything works, it's a lot easier for us on the software side to adjust if the camera used is one provided by Nintendo. End quote. I think it's very good of Nintendo to ensure that any USB-C camera can, in theory, be used, but it will be interesting to see how useful non-Nintendo cameras actually are once the machine is out and a lot more cameras have been trialled. I haven't really seen much research into this so far. At the very least, their collaborations with Hori for the PT Piranha camera means that this should be decently supported, though I guess the lower resolution may make for some issues with facial recognition, though I must admit I haven't really experimented with this too much at the time being. Further questions about hardware specs are batted to Nvidia to answer in the future, but this one is really interesting about Metroid Prime 4's controls and the Joy-Con. Question: when I was playing Metroid Prime 4, I was surprised that the controller could go from mouse to traditional Joy-Con with just a turn of the wrist. How does that work, and why do you choose to make that an organic movement as opposed to something you'd toggle in a menu? Dota says, when it comes to being able to organically or seamlessly switch from mouse control to Joy-Con control, we wanted that to also be available as an option for the software, depending on the software. What that means is, if a software application decides that it's actually better to have a setting or a switch that turns it from mouse control to Joy-Con control, that's also available. With that said, one of the unique features of the Joy-Con 2 is that, aside from the mouse sensor, there's a gyro sensor and an accelerometer. Doing this like a seamless switch between those control schemes is another unique option that the Joy-Con 2 provides. Kawamoto says, from my part of me is happy that we did it, and another part of me is happy that you were surprised by it. The question also says, when you take off the Joy-Con, there's a connector between the Joy-Con and the console that looks like it might break easily. How do you make sure that it doesn't break? Kawamoto responds, it may look a bit flimsy at first glance, but for those of you who've gotten your hands on and been able to touch it, I was hoping that I think you'll see it's not as flimsy as it looks. Sasky says, from the hardware side, we did our best to make sure that it's sturdy. And Kawamoto follows up, when you actually snap the Joy-Con 2 back into place, the force is applied mostly on the coloured portion. There's not a lot of force applied to the connector portion. This is a little detail, but if you look at the connector, it has a bit of give. If there's a lot of force applied, that give will dissipate that force, so it doesn't bear too much on the connector itself. That's the kind of information you'll find in the Nintendo Switch 2 welcome tour, so I hope you play it. Saskia adds, because Mr. Kawamoto is very knowledgeable about our hardware, he's able to create a game like that that teaches so much. Okay, a few things to address in these quotes. I like that the seamless transition from Joy-Con to mouse mode is possible, but also optional for developers who want to make sure that there is a more clear delineation. I think that's a very smart move. I'm really intrigued to see how this will work on Metroid Prime 4, but it also strikes me as potentially problematic, as if you're in handheld mode, you'd have to spend time disconnecting the Joy-Con first, while many people playing docked may prefer using a Pro controller, which sadly seems rodent-free in its design. As for the separation of the Joy-Con, it may of course be a while before any issues with the longevity of this piece of hardware comes to light. Then again, after the experience with Joy-Con 1 and given the length of time they've had, I suspect Nintendo's testing will have been more than usually rigorous to avoid any further complications and complaints. Here's another question that I did find fascinating. Question: have you improved the Bluetooth connections for the Joy-Cons while in TV mode, or the audio connections for the earphones in table mode with Joy-Cons attached or detached? Saskia responds, if I were to go too far into it, I feel like it would take forever, but yes, it has improved. To add a bit more, a lot of those features depend on size. That has a lot of impact. The bigger the antenna, the better the connection. Because we've been able to do that, I think you'll find that the connection has improved. Aside from increasing the number of antennas, there's a lot of other adjustments that we've made to improve that. I like talking about this, but I'll try to save myself because we have limited time. End quote. This is interesting technologically, but my understanding is that for audio devices, including mobile headphones and cochlear implants, they would also need to ensure the software is up to snuff. I'm not an audio expert myself, though, and to my ear, the system sounds great, but I find it a pity that Sasaki cut himself short when discussing this. Here's another question. Why did you decide against analog shoulder buttons on the Joy-Cons and Pro controllers? Sasaki responds, from the hardware side, we worked on what we were asked to do. There were a lot of, let's say, very fussy developers around us who wanted to go this route. That's why we went the route we did. Kawamoto adds, in terms of analog buttons on the shoulders, there are positives, but also negatives. You lose a little bit of instancy when they're analog. We considered it and decided that instant input would be the better option. That's why we decided to move forward with this decision. End quote. Okay, wow, this is the closest I've heard in a long time to someone making, albeit a very good natured and teasing, criticism of some of the others in the team in terms of them being fussy. Or I guess we should say very, very specific. And that's fair enough because they know exactly how they want their games to come across. Analog triggers have long been a question that people have asked about, but I can see that the instantaneous of clicky buttons has advantages as well. And of course, the longer the triggers are the way they are, the more difficult it is to change without affecting the way the whole back catalogue is potentially enjoyed. Does this basically put an end to the hopes of analog triggers returning? I suspect if they ever do, it will be in addition to, rather than in substitution of, the existing buttons, and obviously a controller revision would seem to be years away at this stage. Even if they do that though, it does strike me as potentially being button overkill, but I guess Nintendo will be able to figure this out if anyone will. Here's another question that is of interest. Is the eShop going to be faster for Nintendo Switch 2? Any improvements compared to the previous one? Dota says, in terms of the development of Nintendo Switch 2 and the eShop, Mr. Kawamoto has strong feelings about the eShop, so maybe I'll toss that question to him. Kawamoto explains, when it comes to the eShop, maybe we can back up a little bit. This might be a bit controversial, but in terms of applications on the Wii, I probably booted the Wii shopping channel the most out of any application. When it comes to the eShop, I wanted to make sure it was a smooth experience, that the scrolling of the list was very smooth, that the pages load fast. These are all requests I made to the team in great detail, in great amounts. Sasuke adds, with those requests from Mr. Kawamoto, the network service team in charge of the infrastructure, the team in charge of the server app, the team in charge of the client side of the software, everybody gathered to put all their forces together to make Mr. Kawamoto happy. Kawamoto adds, I'm really excited for the Nintendo Switch 2 release, and I hope you take a look at the eShop. End quotes, and that's also the end of the interview. So Kawamoto continues to be an absolute truth-telling rebel with this one, while he's summarising his demands in simple ways. The great detail and great amounts suggests he clearly had a lot of views around existing eShop. I haven't really had much cause to explore the eShop myself, although I do like the weekly recommendations feature which gives you custom trailers for games you might like. That's a pretty fun idea, and the first set of recommendations that I saw weren't bad at all, although we'll see how they manage with weekly refreshers and whether they end up retreading the same ground too much. Despite being slightly dated, I still really enjoyed this interview and learned a fair bit from it. Thank you as ever for listening, and please do check out the Patreon. I shall look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.